Hi, okay, we're going to talk through the beginning of the Frege paper in this video. I've changed PDF readers. I'm hoping that you will actually be able to see if I select text. That looks good. Okay, let's start from the beginning. Let me just give you first a quick note about translation. So you are reading the version of the edition and translation of this paper coming out of a book called The Frege Reader, edited by Michael Beanie. Footnotes with numbers are from the editor. Footnotes with letters are Frege's originals. So the translation note I wanted to get at is about some of these words that have been left in German here. So sometimes when you see a work of philosophy translated into English and they leave a word in the original language, it's because like it's untranslatable and there's something that's lost going from, say, German to English or whatever. In this case, that's not the reason. So I said last time this in the previous video that this word Sinn will translate as sense, Bedeutung will translate as reference. The reason why this particular book, that Frege Reader leaves the word Bedeutung untranslated here, is because Frege, throughout his career, sort of changes his use of this word. So, starting with this paper, if I recall right, it's starting with this paper that he starts using the word Bedeutung to mean reference specifically, as opposed to something else. Now, I should also say another note about translations. Reference has become the standard English translation for this word Bedeutung, but earlier, particularly in sort of the first half of the 20th century, there were lots of other words used for it. So when we read Russell, your next required reading, he will talk about denotation, and he's using that as a translation of Frege's Bedeutung. So denotation, there's one prominent translation of this article that calls it, instead of on sense and reference, on sense and nominatum, which is confusing. Russell, by the way, instead of saying sense, he says meaning in some places. It's all very confusing. Um, don't feel like you have to stick with the German Bedeutung. You're not losing something by saying reference instead. I'll probably go back and forth myself. Okay, let's launch into the paper. So sentence one, I'm going to go sentence by sentence. I think this paper is the kind of clear that is very unclear, in the sense that if you're very careful and go sentence by sentence and think about what Frege is saying and what he's not saying, and possibly with some background information, he is being very precise, and we can tease out some very complex arguments. This paper is dense with arguments, but you have to be really careful to get them out. Uh, it's easy to find it unclear until you put in a lot of work and tease out the arguments. This is why, well, let's get started. Okay, so first sentence, equality gives rise to challenging questions which are not altogether easy to answer. We're going to be talking about equality. Notice this is Frege's footnote here. He says he uses this word equality in the sense of identity, and understand A equals B to have the sense of A is the same as B, or A and B coincide. I'm mostly not going to use the word equality for this. I'm going to talk about identity. So equality sounds mathematical, right? 2 plus 2 equals 4. But we're talking about something more general than that. So Superman is Clark Kent. Boris Johnson is the current Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. These are, you might think these are is of identity. I'm saying one person is the same thing as another person. Doesn't have to be people. Can be objects, times, whatever. But when we say that one thing is the same thing as another thing, that's the thing that Frege is talking about here. So this thing gives rise to challenging questions which are not altogether easy to answer. Frege is now going to give you two options for what it could be, and he's going to say both of them are bad. He's going to say, is it a relation? And we probably think it is a relation. If it's a relation, is it a relation between objects or between names or signs of objects? Let me just back up a second. Here's sort of the picture. that we've already got going on. So think about, so without doing too much philosophy, we can at least agree that there's a difference between words and the things that the words pick out or refer to. So take a name like Boris, that's a word, it's got letters, 5 of them in fact. Maybe it's something that can be spoken aloud. Distinct from the word, there's a certain person in London most of the time. I should squiggle some hair on here. There's an actual person out there. Okay, we can distinguish this thing from that thing. There's some kind of relationship between them. Right. That name refers to the person out in the world. Okay. So, if I say the person named by this, if I say that Boris is something else, Boris is the Prime Minister of the UK, well, there's a distinction here at the level of names. Maybe you might think I'm talking about, rather than two names, I'm talking about two people in the world. So when Frege says, is this a relation between objects? We're thinking there's a relation between these two things. Objects, people count as objects here, objects out in the world. Or is it a relation between names or signs of objects? So is identity, equality, a relation between these kinds of things? Up here, I think you can see my cursor. Maybe that's really small. Or is it a relation between objects out in the world? I just want to fill out this picture and show we've also got. So this expression, Prime Minister of the UK, refers to a certain person, or is that name refers to a certain person? Right. Okay, so Frege says, in a previous work of mine, I assumed the latter. That is, I assumed identity is a relation between names or signs of objects. Now he's going to tell you, here's why I thought that before, and then he'll say, here's why I'm not satisfied with that anymore. Okay, I made some mistakes. Hopefully I figured out how to sew together two videos. Okay, so here's where we were. Equality gives rise to challenging questions. Is it a relation? If so, is it a relation between objects, option 1, or between names or signs of objects? And he says, in previous work, I assumed the latter. That is, I assumed identity as a relation between names. What I'm now going to do, he says, the reasons which seem to favor this are the following. That is, I'm going to give you my reason for thinking identity must be a relation between names rather than objects. The way this is going to work is I'm going to say, in that previous work I said, here are problems for thinking identity is a relation between objects. And that leaves names. Now in this present work, in this paper that you're reading on sense and reference, he's going to say, actually there are problems for thinking identity is a relation between names too. So we're going to have to come up with some third thing. And that third thing is what he'll call senses. We'll get to that in a second. Okay. So what's the problem with thinking that identity is a relation between objects? Let's see. He says, okay, A equals A and A equals B are obviously statements of differing cognitive value. Wait, hold on. What is he talking about here? Compare a statement like Boris is the Prime Minister of the UK with Boris is Boris. Okay, they have different cognitive value. What exactly is cognitive value? Well, maybe this next part of the sentence explains what that is. A equals A, so Boris is Boris. That holds a priori, and according to Kant, is to be labeled analytic. Okay, pause there. Hopefully you've run into these words somewhere in your other philosophy classes before. Don't worry about them too much. A rough and ready definition of these two things. So a priori things known a priori don't depend on sense experience. You can know them uh, in a way that's sort of logically prior to sense experience. It doesn't mean that you know them earlier in time, not temporally prior to having any sense experience. But your knowledge of them doesn't depend, evidentially, on your sense experience. So people typically think that truths of maths and logic, for example, you can know that they're true without having any sense experience. Kant claims that a sentence like Boris is analytic. So the distinction here is between analytic and synthetic truths. So whether something's a priori or not has to do with how it's known. A priori knowledge, a posteriori knowledge. The sorts of things that are analytic or synthetic are truths, whether they're known or not. Okay. What's the distinction? There are various versions of this distinction out there, and there are many influential philosophers who think there is no good distinction here, but roughly the idea is in an analytic truth, an analytically true sentence proposition, there's sort of no new information contained. It's true just in virtue of the meanings of the words involved. Sometimes people will say in an analytic truth, the predicate is contained in the subject. So one stock example is something like all bachelors are male. So just suppose this is, I think, approximately true. Suppose the word bachelor just means unmarried adult male or something like that. If that's what bachelor means, well, male is already in there, right? If bachelor is unmarried adult male, then when I say all bachelors, who are all three of those things, all bachelors are male, well, male is already contained in the thing, so I haven't given you anything new. On the other hand, if I tell you something like all bachelors are rude, that tells you something new. You need to know more than just the meanings of the words to figure out whether that's true. You're going to have to go outside and look at the bachelors and see if they behave rudely, typically. It might be true. They might both be true. It might be that all bachelors are rude. But you have to actually go and inspect the bachelors to figure out if all bachelors are rude, where you don't have to go and look at any of them to figure out if all bachelors are male. You just need to know what the word means. Okay, so a sentence like Boris is Boris holds a priori. You don't have to go and look at Boris to figure it out. And it's analytic. The predicate Boris is contained in the subject Boris. Boris contains himself. That sounds funny. I think you get what I mean. While, by contrast, statements of the form A equals B often contain very valuable extensions of our knowledge and cannot always be established a priori. Boris is in fact the Prime Minister of the UK. That's a fact. But think back to the night he was elected, recently re-elected, I suppose. If a newspaper ran the headline, Boris is Boris, you would say, I knew that already. But if they tell you, Boris is the Prime Minister, well, you found out news, right? While the election was going on, before it had actually happened, you didn't yet know whether Boris is Prime Minister of the UK. If the newspaper tells you Boris is Prime Minister of the UK, you found out something new. In order for the newspaper reporters to figure that out, they had to actually go and have some sense experience of, vote counters telling them who won the most seats, however politics works. Okay. So here's Frege's example. He says the discovery that the rising sun is not new every morning but always the same was one of the most fertile astronomical discoveries. So think back a very long way. Presumably, well, let's imagine there was a time where people were not sure whether the sun, whether there's like a new sun that comes up every morning. You can imagine one of them saying, "The sun rising now is the sun that rose yesterday morning." That's productive. That tells you, there's no point in walking west until we find that big ball of fire. That tells you it's going to be rising again in the morning. It's not over there anymore. Another example, even today, the re-identification of a small planet or comet is not always a matter of course. Halley's Comet, we call that Halley's Comet not because he was the first person to see it, but because he figured out, hey, those comets that we've seen every, whatever it is, 72 years, that's the same one coming back over and over again. That's a productive discovery. If he says that comet up in the sky is that comet up in the sky, that's not interesting. That's an A equals A kind of sentence. But if he says that comet up in the sky is the one that we read about being up in the sky 72 years ago, I think it's 72, something like that. That's a sentence like A equals B. We have two different names for the same thing. Okay, why does this... That's a distinction between these two kinds of sentences Frege is pointing to. Why does that tell us that identity shouldn't be thought of as a relation between objects? Well, because if we were to regard identity as a relation between that which the names designate, bedeuten, so remember I said I'm going to think of this word as refer to, it would seem that A equals B could not differ from A equals A, that is, provided A equals B is true. What's going on here is there's a problem with this picture I drew. So granted that Boris and the Prime Minister of the UK are the same person, I shouldn't have two different people drawn here, right? They're the same person. So if we're looking at this level down here, I need a bigger brush. If we're looking at this level down here, at the level of actual people in the world, there's no difference between what's named by the name Boris and what's named by PM of the UK. Right. So if I say Boris equals Boris, and we treat that at the level of objects in the world, I'm saying that guy with the hair is the same person as that guy with the hair. But still, if I say Boris is Prime Minister of the UK, again, I'm saying that guy with the hair is the same person as, which is this name, that guy with the hair. They're exactly the same. That's the problem with saying identity is a relation between objects. A relation, if A and B are the same person, so Boris is the Prime Minister of the UK, a relation would thereby be expressed of a thing to itself, and indeed one in which each thing stands to itself but to no other thing. This, if we're looking at a relation out in the world, it's kind of an uninteresting relation, it seems like. Okay, it's not, so when I say, when we discover that the sun this morning is the same as the sun that rose yesterday morning, it's not like a fact about the sun that it relates to itself, that it's the same thing as itself. That can't be right. So, Frege's earlier answer in this earlier work, the Begriffsschrift, was that means we must be talking about, when we talk about identity claims, we must be talking about something having to do with the words themselves. What we apparently want to state by A equals B is that the signs or names A and B refer to, designate the same thing, so that those signs themselves would be under discussion. So when I say Boris is Prime Minister, I'm not telling you something about the man himself. I'm telling you that this name, oops, I swear I know what I'm doing. I'm telling you that this name and this name both point at the same person in the world. I'm telling you something about the connection between these two names. If I tell you this name and this name point at the same person, well, that looks different, right? I mean, I don't need to check the world to see what these two names point at to know they point at the same thing. Of course they point at the same thing because they're the same name. So we get an explanation of this difference in cognitive significance, cognitive value. These are two different names. I have to go and actually check who's named by this one to see if it's the same as who's named by that one. Okay, so Frege's old answer was, this is what identity is. Identity claims tell us about a relation between the names. The relation is they both point to the same thing. So those signs themselves are what's under discussion. When I say Boris is Prime Minister of the UK, I'm telling you about the name Boris, the name Prime Minister of the UK. I'm not telling you about Boris and Boris. A relation between the names would be asserted. But, okay, now he's going to tell you why he's become unsatisfied with his old answer. But this relation would hold between the names or signs only insofar as they named or designated something. It would be mediated by the connection of each of the two signs with the same designated thing. But here's the problem. This is arbitrary. That is. Okay, remember something we talked about in a previous video. Why does the name Kant pick out that particular person? Just because we agree that it does. We could, in principle, decide to start calling him something else. I remember a time, because I'm old enough, when there was a prominent hip-hop producer and personality who would just change his name all the time. Puff Daddy, he was sometimes called, and then it was P. Diddy, and then I remember a specific press conference or like thing on MTV he called where he said, "The P is getting between me and my fans. I'm just Diddy from now on." And he can do that. He can just say, those sounds, those are the ones that name me now. I used to be this other thing, now here's a new sign for me. Okay, Frege doesn't like that. Remember, he cares about language because he wants us to have a precise thing for discovering facts about the world. Facts about which dumb sounds we decide to use to name ourselves, what Diddy does, doesn't matter. He doesn't care about those things. You can use any sign to name anything you like. So if all I'm encoding, all I'm expressing with an identity claim is a relation between one sound and another, if I'm just telling you P. Diddy and Diddy are the same person, that doesn't matter. But look at some of those identity claims that we looked at before, right? Finding out about the rising sun not being new every morning, finding out that some comet is the same as some earlier one. That seems like a really different kind of thing. That seems like it's actually going to encode useful information about the world itself, not just how we choose to talk about the world. Okay, this is arbitrary. He's going to go on expressing problems with this, and I'll give you his solution in a second. So here's where we are now. He's told you why he rejected in earlier work identity being a relation between objects. Now he's having problems with his earlier answer, which was to say identity is a relation between names or signs. Okay, this is arbitrary. Nobody can be forbidden to use any arbitrarily producible event or object as a sign for something. In that case, the sentence A equals B would no longer be concerned with the subject matter. So it's not about the people out in the world. It's not about whether which person is prime minister, but whether we use the words prime minister to name Boris Johnson. We would express no proper knowledge by means of a sentence like this. We would only be telling you about the signs we choose to use to name things in the world, and not about the things in the world themselves. But in many cases, this is just what we want to do. That is, express proper knowledge about the world itself. If the sign A is distinguished from the sign B only as an object, so here by means of its shape, that is, we're writing these things down. So what makes this a different sign from that one? Just that one of them has like a sticky up bit, That's B. The other one is sort of squatting around. That's the A. Not as a sign, that is not by, this is important, the manner in which it designates something. So not the mere fact that it designates something. So not the mere fact that we've chosen to use those 5 letters in a row to refer to the guy with the hair, but how it names them. Not the fact that we happen to agree to use the words Prime Minister of the UK to mean Boris, but the reason why or the way in which that expression picks out that person. If the sign A is distinguished from the sign B only as an object, not as a sign, the cognitive value of A equals A becomes essentially equal to that of A equals B, provided A equals B is true. A difference between them can arise only if the difference between the signs corresponds to a difference in the mode of presentation of the thing designated. This mode of presentation is what he's going to in a second call a sense. Do you know what a mode of presentation is? I don't. It's obscure. He's going to try and illustrate now. I told you Frege is a mathematician. You will sometimes in this paper see mathematical examples that are maybe more complicated than they need to be, just because these things seem clear and familiar to Frege. If you ever get stuck on a mathy thing and I haven't told you what to do with it, send me an email and I can probably give you a substitute example. But here's one of his. Okay. Frege says, actually, I'm going to skip over the stuff he does in words because this translation put in a diagram that works a little better. Okay, here's a fact, just a fact you can prove in Euclidean geometry, maybe any kind of geometry, I don't know. Take any triangle you like and draw 3 lines in the following kind of way. Take a corner and then take the exact middle of the opposite side. So do that for each of the 3 corners. Here's the fact. Those 3 lines, as it turns out, no matter what triangle you have, are all going to cross at the same place. Okay. Now, Frege says, here's an identity claim we can make. The point of intersection of line A and line B is the same as the point of intersection of B and C. In both cases, we're talking about this point. It's the same point. So where does A cross B? It crosses here. Where does B cross C? It crosses there. We're saying, if I say A and B intersect at the same point where B and C intersect, we can think of this as an A equals B sentence. It's unfortunate that we're reusing the letters A and B, but we're saying this name equals this name. Okay. Now, in this case, those particular names seem to pick out a particular point in a non-arbitrary kind of way. It's not just that I'm saying I'm going to call this point Boris and I'm going to call that point Schmorris, and it's the same point. That's a fact about me and what I choose to call Boris and what I choose to call Schmorris. But point of intersection of A and B, this gives you a way, like a recipe of finding a particular point. It says, find this line, find that line, follow them along until they run into each other, and you'll wind up here. This name also gives you instructions. It picks out a certain point in a structured kind of way. It says, look at the line B, look at the line C, find out where they meet. When I say those 2 names pick out the same thing, refer to the same point, I'm telling you there's 2 different ways of getting to the same place. I'm telling you, if you follow the line B until you run into C, you'll wind up in one place. If you follow the line A until you run into the line B, you'll wind up in the same place. Okay, this sort of recipe, this means, this way of picking out that particular point, that's what Frege in a second is going to call a sense. Now, at this point, all he's committed to is saying there are some cases, there are some names that are like this, that are like point of intersection of A and B, in that they give you particular instructions or they have a structured way of picking out the thing they pick out. The next move he's going to make is say, maybe every name has something like that. Maybe every name that picks something out does so in a structured kind of way. He says it's natural now to think of their being connected with a sign besides that which the sign designates, which may be called the reference of the sign. Also what I should like to call the sense of the sign wherein the mode of presentation is contained. That's a long sentence. Let's back it up. Okay, previously we had this picture. There's the word Boris, and there's the particular person that that refers to. So there's that connection, right? The name Boris refers to the person. Frege is now saying maybe as well as those two things, as well as the sign Boris and the reference of the sign, that is the person out there who is probably in London right now, there is also the sense of the sign. What's the sense? Well, it's something like a mode of presentation. So maybe what we want to say is associated with this name, there is a certain sense. And it's by means of that sense is how Boris picks out, refers to, or presents to you that particular person. And maybe this name, Prime Minister of the UK, although it has the same reference as Boris, maybe that has a different sense. That is, that picks this person out in a different way, just like the difference between point of intersection of A and B, point of intersection B and C. Frege wants to say, in our example, those two expressions have the same reference or Bedeutung, meaning they pick out the same point. But they have different senses. They get you to that point in different ways, two different routes to get to the same destination. The reference of evening star would be the same as that of morning star, but not the sense. Okay, we've made a bit of a move here. So point of intersection of A and B, that seems to carry right there in the expression a recipe for finding this point, right? Follow the line A until you hit line B. Evening star is a little bit different. That kind of looks like just a plain name. It's kind of like Boris, but it's got some structure in it, right? So what's the evening star? It's that star that appears first at night before any of the other stars. That's the evening star. Likewise, what's the morning star? It's the star that disappears last in the morning after all the other ones. I know the sun doesn't count. That's not a star. It's a star. It doesn't count. Okay, here's an astronomical fact. The evening star and the morning star are the same star. In fact, it's not a star. It's the planet Venus. But so Frege is going to say, even though this thing looks like a name, evening star, it's got a mode of presentation associated with it. It contains with it a way of finding that thing. Okay, this way of finding the thing is what he's going to call the sense. And he's suggesting, even for other cases, even for other words like, say, Boris, where it's not so obvious what the mode of presentation is. I mean, the name Boris doesn't contain with it, like, stay up at night and see if he appears before any other member of parliament. That isn't a thing. But Frege is going to say, even if we can't tell what the sense is, or say what it is, or like give a recipe for finding that guy, let's hypothesize that there is such a thing as senses. Why should we hypothesize this? Because it explains what's going on with identity claims, right? If we just thought all there is in the linguistic world is names and the things they refer to, then it's hard for us to explain how identity claims work. I recommend thinking of, so I think of Frege's argument for senses as being like the way we think about electrons. Nobody's ever actually seen an electron. But if we hypothesize, and nobody ever will see electrons, they're really weird things. But if we hypothesize that there are electrons, even though we can't observe them, that helps us explain a lot of other stuff. Lots of other stuff. Same kind of relationship here. Frege thinks, I mean, I understand Frege as thinking, in a case like point of intersection of A and B, maybe there the mode of presentation, the sense is almost observable. In Evening Star, we can kind of see something like it. In other cases like Boris, maybe we can't even imagine what the sense is. It's really hard to put your finger on it. But if we hypothesize that there is a sense there for every word. That helps us explain what identity claims are doing in general, how they can, um, how we can make a difference, see a difference between A equals A and A equals B, and yet have identity claims tell us something about the world rather than just about our arbitrary choice of which words to use. That's the kind of thing this is. Okay, that's what senses are. I know you're probably thinking, I'm still not really sure what a sense is. That's fine. Frege doesn't expect you to completely get it at this point. There's a lot more article here where he's working on developing that idea. The idea of a sense is that's the new thing in this paper. He's saying just having words and objects isn't enough. Just having the reference of a word isn't enough. I think we need this thing called a sense too. It's a little bit mysterious. We've got to figure out how it works in general, how the senses of words might change when you put them in different kinds of sentences. There's a lot of detail to get to, but that's the basic idea. We will later on, in the very next reading, when you read Russell, he's going to say, I'm a fan of this theory. We can explain a lot by means of what Frege has done, but I just don't get what senses are, and they seem to be really confusing. Can we maybe do without them? So something to bear in mind as we go on with the readings is the kind of argument that Frege has given for the existence of senses. It's something like an inference to the best explanation. He's saying there's this thing, identity claims, that is mysterious. It's hard to explain what identity claims could be all about unless we think there are senses. So any later theory that's going to say I don't get senses, I want to say there's no such thing as a sense after all. They'd better be able to explain the stuff that Frege was explaining by means of sense. That's something to keep in mind for the future. I'm going to stop here, as always. If anything wasn't clear, if I can say more about any of this, send me an email.